Our first speaker is Daniel Williams, who's going to cover climate change vulnerability and adaptive capacity in the interior West, a research program to improve assessments and enhance resilience of communities at risk. Dan's a research social scientist with the Human Dimensions Science Program of the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins. Dan received his PhD in forest resources from the University of Minnesota, so all those U of M grads out there, go Gophers. And he was a visiting Fulbright scholar with the Eastern Norway Research Institute in Lillehammer, Norway in 1999, an interesting piece of history, and currently serves as co-editor-in-chief of the research journal Society and Natural Resources. His current research examines the social conditions that make resource-dependent communities vulnerable to landscape change and social factors that contribute to creating the adaptive capacities of communities and institutions to make them more resilient in the face of such change. A terrific topic for the workshop here this week. So with that, Dan, I'm going to turn this over to you. All right. And you can use that mic.
I don't know. My title went on and on. I must have had I had run-on-itis or something when I got, asked to do that. The other thing is that, this business about climate change and LCCs and all this stuff, did I get that right? LCC? See, that's how much of a novice I am to this thing. I'm still trying to figure out what all that stuff is. So what I think I'm going to do is highlight some efforts that a group that I'm part of has been going through for about a year, trying to get a handle on this topic of social vulnerability, sometimes called community vulnerability, related to climate change. So let's just do that here. Let's see if I can figure out all the technologies here. So I'm going to hit the highlights, I would say, for this topic. I can't really let's see. Do I have to point this somewhere? That's the pointer. There we go. Okay. To give a bit of background on how we got into this, about a year ago, the Forest Service research leadership team targeted the topic of social vulnerability to climate change as something they wanted to invest a little bit more in. And they asked a group of four of the research stations to participate, individuals within those stations to participate in this effort. And I think they targeted people in those stations because we had been doing a little bit of work primarily on vulnerability and adaptive capacity related to wildland fire. So part of this topic for me is really just trying to move from the fire realm into this climate change realm and try to figure out, well, what is the significance of that somewhat shift in framing? So basically, looking at what they handed out to us, they said, we would like coordination across these research stations, including the Northern Station, the Pacific Northwest Station, the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and the Southern Station. And why those four and not the other one, I'm not quite sure, but anyway. So they asked us to do this, to try to develop framework to identify the populations most vulnerable to climate change impacts, to assess social vulnerability indices that could be applied at multiple scales, and examine resources, tools, and strategies to improve adaptive capacity of socially vulnerable populations. And now, as I was being introduced, I realized, well, apparently I'm in a tools session. Is that right? The end of the tools session. Well, don't hold your breath. So anyway, I'm going to describe a little bit about what we've done over this past year. There's a little bit of a background in that a little bit before that, myself, Jess Montag from USGS in Fort Collins, and a collaborator of mine at the University of Montana did some interviews with scientists and managers about what do they see as the climate change issues that they need more information on. So we had already started a little bit of an investigation of what's the research agenda we should be moving forward on. And I think that had something to do with us getting involved then in this national initiative. And we had already targeted the idea of developing a research workshop on what we were calling adaptive capacity, and we sort of incorporated social vulnerability into that idea of the workshop. So we kind of had this going a little bit. Anyway, then we held this workshop in November of this past year, And we're just now getting some stuff out on the ground in terms of some pilot testing of some of the ideas that were generated through both the workshop and some literature review work that in particular very bright postdoc Dan Murphy, who's at the University of Montana now, a new hire at the University of Cincinnati in anthropology. So we're also wondering what we're going to do about the fact that he's leaving. But anyway, because he's been so valuable to this process. To go back a little bit, I think, again, in this context of talking to an audience that, for one, is not necessarily Forest Service, and I excuse any acronyms that I might accidentally use that are sort of inside the agency, but to also frame it maybe a little bit for people that aren't as tuned into the social science aspects of it, the whole issue of community vulnerability and social vulnerability has a long history in the Forest Service in terms of the idea of managing the national forests in the rural parts of the country to maintain, community stability. And a lot of that had to do with timber management because a lot of those communities were dependent on timber harvesting. So the Forest Service has always had its eye on this question of what makes a community stable and how do our management practices influence those sorts of things. The other origins, as I alluded to earlier, is that vulnerability is a well-developed topic in the natural hazards area, earthquakes, hurricanes, and all that sort of thing. And we had already started to move that literature into this realm of the wildland-urban interface. That's what the WUI stands for, dealing with the vulnerability that residents and communities that live in this interface zone have to wildfire. So we're already looking at those things and trying to think about what makes communities resilient and what makes them adaptive under those circumstances. And the other thing that's happening, of course, is more on the management side, is this idea of reframing a little bit what we're doing. I've heard references to this idea a little bit about moving from sort of project level, sometimes we call it stand level in forestry problems, to these landscape scale problems, and that we're really not as adept at dealing with those things. So we're, as a management community, trying to learn how to deal with these larger scale processes, such as climate change, such as fire, such as bark beetles, in the Colorado and so forth. And one of the elements that we talk about nowadays in one of our buzzwords is the idea of all lands. That it's not that we're managing everybody's lands, but that our lands are embedded in or mixed with other people's lands. And that when we think about management, we need to think about managing the larger landscape and not just Forest Service specific lands. The other thing that happened is that the Forest Service came up with this idea within the management side of a climate change scorecard, where basically each forest or each unit has to report its progress on climate change. And so we're being asked, well, one of the elements we're supposed to report on is how have we addressed social vulnerability? How have we addressed community vulnerability and capacities in our management? And then they turn to us and say, well, tell us how to do that. So we said, well, okay, that's one of the things that we want to try to do. So we held this workshop as recently as November, did a lot of literature review. We identified three main sort of focal points for going forward. One is just advancing the state of the knowledge, and I would even say sort of just assessing the state of knowledge on social vulnerability, hopefully to improve assessments, to bring the community perspectives into the research, and to integrate also the social and ecological perspectives. The other is this idea of science application, and I see our lead for science application sitting in the audience. That's a good thing. Here again, this has a lot to do with connecting what we're doing with the scorecard kinds of tasks that the agency's addressing, and that we would probably do some kind of case studies with some of those forests to try to work on those processes. And then the third piece is just sort of this general need to do more communication outreach and coordination across agencies, across our own agency boundaries and so forth. Okay, let's get to the literature view. And we've seen some of these definitions, and we started by kind of going through the definitions, and these are by no means the only definitions for these terms. So that's your first challenge, okay? What do people mean by vulnerability? What do they mean by capacity, adaptive capacity? What do they mean by resilience? And I won't repeat these here, but we just, not for sure what was going to be up on the screen yesterday. We saw some of these very same definitions in the opening presentations. One that we didn't see And one that did come up earlier this morning, I think, not so much the definition, but the whole idea of governance is one of the things that's really changing, I think, when we move to a landscape scale approach, is that we move kind of from a traditional notion of government and lines of authority to more of the practice of governance and how governance is accomplished by multiple stakeholders, multiple institutions, through networks, and so forth, and that this is an adaptive response to these large-scale, complex problems. And so one of the things that social science can do, hopefully, is help us focus on the nature of this governance process and both how it's emergent sometimes, sort of in unplanned ways, and other ways in which we try to actually accomplish governance in new ways. Out of this discussion, I just made a list of things that seem to be some of the questions and issues that sort of surround what we're trying to do here. One of the first things that became evident in looking at the vulnerability research request we got from the Washington office was, and that's what FSRET stands for, by the way, Forest Service Research Executive Team. So those are the big bosses in Washington. Was that they seem to be concerned about the disproportionate impacts to vulnerable groups. So certain segments of society are more or less vulnerable, perhaps, to climate change. But if you look at the IPCC definition, and a lot of the literature is also about vulnerable communities. This would be more in the sense of a place-based group of people. This community is vulnerable, perhaps because of the proximity they have to the hazard or risk or so forth. So that's one of the things that so we have two very different ways of framing what people mean by social vulnerability right there. Also, there are a lot of assumptions both within our own sort of agency culture and conventional wisdom and so forth, and in the literature about the particular social conditions that make some individuals, households, social groups, communities more or less vulnerable. And when you really go through that literature, I mean, there are a lot of big questions there, and I think we should be a little bit more open to the possibility that maybe we don't really understand some of these things so well. So, for example, even this commonly referred to equation of vulnerability as something to do with exposure plus sensitivity plus lack of adaptive capacity, there's a lot of people that really find that a little bit too much of a static model in terms of thinking about vulnerability, because vulnerabilities are produced by the actions of people as well and not just something that they're exposed to. If you look at the resilience literature, there are moral dimensions to resilience that often don't come up in the ecological literature. Just because a system is resilient, that doesn't make it a politically desirable, fair, equitable system. So we have issues of equity and power and the distribution of well-being and so forth that we need to confront when we talk about resilience. And so in some cases we want to make social systems not resilient because they need to change in some sense of the greater good. Hopefully, by taking a systems perspective, we can also bring the social and ecological work together more effectively, and this idea that we need to focus on governance. Right here. So, the complexity of it is, when we sat down and looked at the literature, and this is just, just a series of just boxes and categories, there's a lot of complexity within each one of these, but one of the things that we see is at least 4 different ways of framing this whole idea of vulnerability from an outcome-oriented way that it's framed. And I've heard a fair bit of that type of framing at this conference, where basically somebody's exposed to something and therefore is vulnerable. And then in some sense they're inherently vulnerable by the nature of who they are or how they're situated. As opposed to more context-oriented ways of thinking about it, which really looks at the internal sort of social dynamics of things in specific places and how that affects vulnerability. We have these systems-oriented theories that we're seeing a lot of when we go to the resilience conferences and so forth, which deal with a lot of different kinds of factors. And then one of the things is this idea that actors are sort of more actively engaged in dealing with vulnerability, not just passive to vulnerability. So just as an example, one of the ways in which this guy O'Brien talks about, he describes this outcome vulnerability as kind of a linear notion of a change, an exposure, a response, and then one is vulnerable, versus a very contextualized system that sees vulnerabilities as being produced and reproduced in the social systems that we're studying, rather than simply something that someone is exposed to, or some unit. It could be a community or a household or an industry or something that they're exposed to from the outside. One of the interesting things about the systems literature, I think, is that they pay a little bit more attention, I think, to this topic of governance, and so there's some advantages to looking at. So here, for example, looking at the institutions, the social norms and rules, the laws and policies and so forth that actually govern what actors can and can't do, and create and organize the management actors and organizations, and how those things interact with the drivers of change, the system dynamics, and even the knowledge systems that come into play. So these discussions about local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and so forth are very important in these kinds of models. Just to give you an illustration of where people have gone with this sort of thing, is this is a fairly recent publication, the Adaptive Capacity Wheel. And one of the first things you see there, as you look kind of in the middle section, say, of the one on the left, that they identify sort of 4 major factors that contribute to this issue of capacity to adapt. So it's not just resources, poverty or wealth or something like that, but it's the structures of government. Are the government structures fair? There's also questions of variety, diversity, and so forth. The more diverse systems are, the more capable they are responding differently. There's capacities to learn within these institutions and organizations and so forth. And then there's leadership is an important element of these kinds of things. So in this case, they come up with a complex index. I showed this to the chief of the Forest Service. He says that's a little bit too much complexity. But the idea is that we can look at a lot of different factors, and we shouldn't rush to just push it all into one index, more or less vulnerability, because it's really how these different things play out together that becomes important. Anyway, in this study, they compared 2 different cities in the Netherlands. Okay, well, given all these different frameworks, then there are also different approaches to the ways in which research is done to look at social vulnerability. And one of the interesting things that Dan Murphy pointed out is that most of the work on social vulnerability to climate change is not being done in North America. It's being done somewhere else. So we've got a lot to learn from how this stuff is being done elsewhere to really get up to speed on these kinds of things. And so here, just a whole suite of things, from these outcome-oriented, different approaches to outcome-oriented designs, to these case-based, a lot of scenario-based types of processes, and even this newfangled thing called agent-based modeling, which, it's like, oh my God, I got to go into that at some point and figure out what that's about. But we can use simulations basically to model how people behave under different circumstances. So just quickly here, the Interior West research project that we're trying to initiate, and we're just getting into the field, really aims to just improve our basic understanding of the key contributors to social vulnerability and adaptive capacity. Use a scenario-based approach where we have people engage climate change scenarios, not necessarily the predictive, downscaled scenarios, but engage different what-ifs in the process of thinking about how they would be impacted by climate change, and then hopefully provide this to national forests and other federal and local agencies and non-governmental actors. So we're going to try to apply a much more actor-oriented and contextual-oriented framework. We're going to use scenario-building focus groups exercises to generate these community assessments of their vulnerabilities. So they're also participating in generating their sense of what it is that makes them vulnerable, and what is it that would give them capacity to address these things. And these are very tentative, but we're doing a pilot test right now in the Big Hole Valley as we speak. I'm going to go up to Montana next week and actually find out what we're learning from that work. And then the other 2 are where we think we might go, and if we can find enough money, we can go elsewhere too. So, we're not limited to these things. And we haven't tied these to LCCs specifically, but they're obviously potentially in different LCCs. I don't know if I really have time for this, but this just kind of illustrates this methodology that we've really just invented. Dan, again, Murphy had a lot to do with this, where we go through a series of scenario building exercises, kind of upscaling them as we go along. So first we deal with sort of actors on the ground, and then we move into the larger institutions within the community and so forth. And we we have them work through these scenarios, we analyze what they said, we rework the scenarios, have other people look at them in focus groups and refine these things. And so not only are we refining the scenarios, but we're also looking at how people think about the risks and so forth. So we're also extracting from them their perceptions of their situation. 2 slides left. Ultimately, we hope to be able to also bring some of this rapid assessment technique into individual forest processes where they can use these things to do some of their own scorecard type work. I made a list of things that we might get from this. Well, Dan had a lot to do with making this list too, I should say, Dan Murphy. Hopefully better understanding of local communities, assessing the feasibility of these participatory approaches, and just how rapid and how much time and energy does it actually take to do these things. Provide initial assessments of the social impacts and ecological impacts, and then facilitate community engagement. Maybe this is more of a discussion slide should we have questions, but stationarity is dead, we've heard many times here, and this is a point that's been raised by others as far back as 1995 about the idea that stability, we've built so much around the idea of stability that we have to learn how to think about lack of stability. I also want to put one on the table that maybe we haven't talked about so much is the limits of top-down knowledge systems. That how much information can we really collect and process in making decisions? And one of our own scientists, Joe Tainter, he's no longer with the agency, raises this problem. And then this whole idea of governance and what that means. So I'll stop there.
We've got time for a few questions for Dan before we bring Adam up. So questions, comments?
Sure.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Deanna Spooner, coordinator for the Pacific Islands LCC. And what you've outlined here seems very familiar to folks who have been doing scenario planning outside of the U.S., but also through National Park Service. So I'm just wondering if you can explain the similarities and differences of already established scenario planning methodologies?
Probably not. I probably can't really say too much about it. I mean, my sense in our own agency is that we haven't done that. And if you're doing more in other agencies, I think that's great. I think there are there's distinctions. I mean, are you working with, scenarios that are produced by scientists? But there's also scenario planning, which is something that I did as an exercise in the fire world, where we were brought in by a bunch of us were brought to a consulting firm that it's more like scenario exercise, and it's really about futuring. Yeah. So so we're probably a little bit of a hybrid. We're trying to use the technical information we have about the kinds of things that would happen on the ground, say in terms of climate change, but it's not to sort of say, well, which of these scenarios is more likely or any of that kind of stuff. It's really a tool to get people thinking. So I think it's probably a bit more like what you're talking about. And I've participated in one of those to look at what kind of knowledge and information do we need to deal with wildland fire, and are we thinking outside the box enough? And that was an exercise to get us to think outside the box. I found it a very interesting process. Clear as mud.
Well, think about that.
Okay.
After Adam's done, if you think of something for Dan, we'll bring Dan back up to the front after that. But our next speaker this afternoon is Adam Paris. Adam comes to the meeting from NOAA. Over the last 10 years, Adam has worked extensively in both science and policy, serving as that important bridge and the boundary between the two. Adam is the lead program manager for NOAA's regionally integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, RISA, at the Climate Program Office. With that, Adam, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thanks. I want to say right now, after watching Dan's talk, we never knew each other before today. So to the extent that I hit on a lot of these themes in my presentation, that's just a happy coincidence. I was looking at this slide this morning before loading it onto the computer, and I thought of a joke that we tell in NOAA or at least that I tell in NOAA. How many NOAA employees does it take to put together a PowerPoint presentation? And the answer in this case, of course, is that the font is so small that you can't even tell. But I'm not Steve Jobs, and I'm not here to talk about fonts. What I want to talk about is NOAA's regional activities. And in our parlance, regional equates to, I think, landscape scale. So the way that we think about things on a landscape scale or broader than a project scale is really at the regional level. And when we talk about regional collaboration and regional climate science and services, which will be a main focal point of the presentation, we really think about, after years of doing this, networks and maintaining trust between different people. So that is a big deal for us in terms of establishing networks to solve landscape and environmental change. And it also requires diversity of ways of knowing, flexibility of approaches, and multiple levels of governance. Definitely a theme that I want to hit on. So being from NOAA, I have to give you a forecast. I'll just tell you what I'm going to talk about and go through it as quickly as possible. I'll probably run out of time. So why collaboration? Why would we work? Why would NOAA's regional activities, why and how would they work with LCCs and with CSCs? I'll give you some examples of NOAA initiatives where we're already linked up with LCCs and CSCs, thankfully, and then opportunities for enhanced collaboration. Just starting a little bit at the national level, there has been a policy driver for supporting decision makers in changing environments for over 20 years. The U.S. Global Change Research Act calls for usable science, science to support policy and decision making. But what we've learned over that 20 years from field efforts all the way down to the ground, in fact, mostly from the ground on up to the regional level, is that usable science really, the key elements of usable science are context, not just context of place, but also context of specific decisions that people are grappling with, and some key tenets like credibility, legitimacy, and saliency. So none of those qualities are articulated specifically with regard to usable science in the U.S. Global Change Research Act. And I would argue that's actually a really great opportunity for some of the local and regional, state and regional efforts to scale up into national science policy. That's something that I think we really have to rectify, is be more specific about what we mean by usable science if we're going to reconcile the amount of money that we spend on basic research, which is absolutely necessary, and usable science or applied research. More recently, this was touched on this morning, actually. I think Marcy Rockman touched on this a little bit, but more recently there's been a couple of other drivers. The Obama administration set up a task force, the Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, and one of the things that they're really emphasizing is coordination at the regional level across different federal climate activities. And then finally, federal agencies are now required to develop adaptation plans, and that is actually creating a lot more demand for information, not just at the national level, but actually at the regional, state, and local level too, because federal agencies have offices at all of those levels. So this is actually from some early work by Mickey Glantz, who was at NCAR and is now at the University of Colorado. But he was looking at the health of Peruvian fisheries and I think some domestic fisheries in the context of seasonal to interannual climate forecasts and conditions and the context of socio-political dimensions. So it's kind of hard to see the detail in this slide, but I think what he's really trying to emphasize are a few things, that climate patterns are, particularly as El Nino emerged as a recognizable pattern, that's something that we can say, speak to intelligibly to people making decisions, and it's recognizable at the regional level. So it's one important part of a place-based approach or landscape scale efforts is being able to discern some of these patterns. Another part is this is where we see overlapping institutions. So we start to see the interaction across sectors, across disciplines, but also across decision-making bodies. And that's really important, not just for conservation, but also for equity, social equity issues, because some of these communities actually subsist on those resources. In fact, a lot of work has been done on fisheries with respect to governance that Daniel touched on, and common pool resources and governance and how networks within those resources relate to each other. Elinor Ostrom, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, she's actually a political scientist, but won the Nobel Award in economic sciences for her work on the tragedy of the commons and her research on networks, where she drew a lot from fisheries communities. And as recently as last year, she emphasized in a lecture on protecting institutional diversity the importance that the points that no one system or entity can solve a problem like environmental change alone. In fact, what we have to have is multiple, multi-level adaptive governance schemes for science policy, for resource management, for research, all of those things. And really, governance can mean, as I'll show in a minute, it can mean formal agreements. It can mean, wiring diagrams. It can mean matrices. But I think it also means things like trust and tolerance, being able to respect that we may have slightly different views, but that we're willing to work together and collaborate around certain problems. That is part of governance too. Okay, so NOAA is a partner of DOI already, and just a little reminder for those of you who are not so familiar with NOAA, our mission is to understand and predict changes in climate, weather, oceans, and coasts, to share that knowledge with people, knowledge and information with others, and to conserve and manage coastal and ocean resources. So I'm primarily here going to focus on climate, as I have been. That's what I'm most familiar with. But we do have folks in the room. Roger Griffiths, who many of you saw yesterday, who works with the National Marine Fisheries Service. We have folks who work with the National Ocean Service, Coastal Services Center, and so forth in the room. So it'd be great to connect with those people after on those specific dimensions. But those goals that I mentioned of NOAA's mission and goals are very complementary to the Department of the Interior's. Science to inform people, service to help people make decisions, and stewardship of resources. Well, when you talk about a problem like environmental change, that is actually something where we have to work across agencies. So if you call back to the U.S. Global Change Research Act, it establishes a framework and a program, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, for all of us to come together around science priorities that we can't, and decision support and applied research priorities that we can't solve together. So that's really something that I think we all have to commit to, and it's going to be incredibly important. Most recently, the USGCRP has supported the National Climate Assessment, and that's been the evolution of the latest National Climate Assessment is that we are trying to develop a more sustained process, and that'll hopefully support more of these networks working together. So I'll illustrate some examples of ways that NOAA connects to LCCs, but really quickly, with a large-scale driver of global change, climate is a huge driver. I mean, it cuts across, it's a very large scale. It's not the only large-scale driver of environmental change, but it's a really big one. And when you think about basic supply and demand of information, we are seeing a really increasingly large demand for climate information across multiple timescales. Farmers need to know about drought conditions, days, weeks, months in advance. Urban planners need to know how many, if they're going to experience more heat waves over the next 10 to 20 years, and water managers are considering decisions about whether or not to invest billions of dollars in new water supply infrastructure to keep water supply for ecosystems, for agriculture, and for drinking. So recognizing that there is this really large problem ahead of us and that DOI and NOAA, with our complementary goals, we're going to be working together, we established a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, in 2010. And I think really, one of the messages in developing that was there's plenty of work to be done. There's plenty of success to be had. We are really there's plenty of room. We're probably still going to see more demand that we can't necessarily satisfy in the short term. So we're going to have to continue to work together. But the MOU is really a form of governance. It establishes a formal partnership and talks about areas where we can complement each other. And already it's been a success. Amy Holman, who's the NOAA regional team lead in Alaska, serves as the steering committee chair for the Western Alaska LCC. Amy's here. The NOAA regional climate services directors, which I'll explain a little bit more in detail, sit on 12 LCC steering committees. So they're already, embedded in the community, and that's a good thing in terms of coordinating across NOAA and DOI. And then we established a position, the Gulf of Mexico Landscape Conservation Liaison, out of the National Ocean Service, Laurie Rounds, who's also here, to foster better ties between NOAA and the LCCs in the Gulf of Mexico region. So what does our regional climate services partnership look like? Well, it's really a network of networks that draws on all 4 of NOAA's mission areas, including oceans and coasts, climate, and weather. So we have offices, we have multiple offices contributing to this network of networks. You can see that it's not just regional scale, but a lot of different locations. The map is imperfect, but we have weather forecast offices, we have sea grant offices, state climatologists, the National Integrated Drought Information System. Roger Pulwarty, the director of NIDIS, is here. Regional climate centers, and then of course I'm primarily concerned with, on a day-to-day basis, the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or the RISA teams. But all of these activities revolve around some unifying themes, that we do things with a place-based focus, where we understand regional culture and context through active engagement. We encourage the intersection between the physical and natural sciences and the social sciences. We recognize climate change as a major stressor for ecosystems. We're promoting collaborative, participatory processes where we iteratively interact with decision makers and users. And we recognize and respect complementary roles. We have that tolerance of each other and that collaborative spirit. What's reflected in the diagram on the lower left-hand corner, which is really just a conceptual diagram that explains, some aspects of our regional climate services, or the way we think about that, is that 2 other really important elements: that we maintain a focus on decision makers or users of climate information. We understand the needs on the ground and incorporate that into our science and services. And then secondly, that we're really placing an emphasis on coordination at the regional level, and that's why we have 5 regional climate services directors. Dave Brown from the South is here. He's one of those individuals that sits on LCC steering committees. And Ellen McCrae from the Northeast is also here. She also sits on LCC steering committees, and Doug Cluck, I think, is here, from the Midwest. So on some specific activities that relate to different LCC goals, the National Integrated Drought Information System has been in effect for a long time. But really, I think and the NIDIS has the drought monitor, so you can actually go to the drought portal or website, drought.gov, and see the drought monitor. It gives you real-time information about unfolding drought conditions across the U.S. But in addition to those sort of information products and services, it also supports regionally relevant and participatory activities. So many of you know that in the South, we've recently been having, last year we suffered from some pretty bad droughts. And being networked across all these different activities, Dave Brown mobilized some a Managing Drought webinar series with the RCCs, our regional climate centers, state climatologists, and the RISAs, where they would have webinars with decision makers, explain to them a little bit about the science behind what we know, or in other words, what we know, how confident we are in it with respect to the drought conditions, and then allowed for some interaction with the decision makers, fielding questions and not just serving this information at them. We also support, through competitive research, a number of different, so the Climate and Societal Interactions Program, which revolves really around 3 dimensions, which is identifying and assessing risk and impacts, improving accessibility and utility of information, and then engaging federal and non-federal partners to take some of what we're learning in applied research and put that, make sure that is diffused in the federal practice in different services. So we have an international program that's currently being competed. We have a sectors program, the Sectoral and Applications Research Program, and the Coast and Ocean Climate Adaptation Program. Those provide 1 to 3 year grants for individuals, scientists working with decision makers, particularly around interdisciplinary issues, and then of course the Regionally Integrated Science and Assessments, or RISA program. And all of those were an outgrowth of an earlier Human Dimensions program. This is a product from some of the work that the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program, the RISA out of the University of Oklahoma and Louisiana State, developed as a part of research to support the National Climate Assessment. So some of our social scientists did a needs assessment across the state of Oklahoma. And what they're finding is really decision makers need climate information across a range of timescales. This actually shows the maximum planning timescale for different sectors, including human health, agriculture, energy, society and public safety, ecosystems, transportation, and water managers. We also have, through the Coastal Services Center, a Human Dimensions program that helps coastal communities think about or provide social science methods, tools, data, and technical assistance to support social and economic and ecological well-being of people in coastal communities, including the Great Lakes. This is a coastal county snapshot. You can actually download these for most of the counties in the lower 48, and I think including Alaska. This one's from Atlantic County, New Jersey, which includes Atlantic City, because who can forget about Jersey? But it actually shows something about not just demographics in that county, flooding, risks to flooding, and then also, and for example, who is in the critical floodplain zones of the FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. We've recently established a Sentinel Site program. These are different locations, 5 locations in Maryland, North Carolina, Florida, Hawaii, and California, that are going to be looking at delivering useful information on the rate and impacts of sea level rise in coastal areas. So this is actually, these 5 sites will be a really good place for LCCs to connect to and maybe extend some of those conservation activities into the seascape. NMFS, our National Marine Fisheries Service, is also doing work on how climate impacts living marine resources, including linking up climate models with ocean models, but also just understanding how climate impacts different fisheries communities and marine protected areas. So that includes a range of data and analysis and also processes for engagement. This is an example from Amy and the folks in the Western Alaska LCC. They've been working on a coastal storms pilot that draws on NOAA's ocean weather and climate services. So they're really they're trying to connect physical science with biological science to understand the impacts to natural resources, land, emergency, and community managers. And actually this, I think, is a really good example of the type of project that Daniel was talking about, where they're developing science but also trying to integrate local knowledge. Because obviously these communities on the western coast of Alaska are facing serious risks with respect to storm surge and coastal flooding, and they have a lot to say about that, a lot of useful information to integrate with the science. So it's not just top-down expert management, but it's also bottom-up, incorporating bottom-up local and indigenous knowledge. Some of the work that Laurie has been doing as the Gulf liaison, she's been working to advance identified shared goals for coastal conservation in the Gulf. We have a number of different coastal zone programs all across the U.S., including in the Gulf of Mexico. These are voluntary programs that are designated as the federal coastal zone manager in different states. And then we also have a series of national estuarine research reserves. That are marine protected areas, including in the Gulf of Mexico. So DOI and NOAA have actually already established a Center for Marine Protected Areas to look at where climate is a major priority, climate change is a major priority for marine conservation. And then finally, Doug has been working in the Missouri River Basin. They're obviously experienced the exact opposite of drought last year. There were serious floods in the Missouri River Basin, and he's really been trying to develop a forum to connect people from different agencies as well as within NOAA's regional climate activities to maintain a discussion about evolving conditions and be able to have a discussion with that about decision makers and also across different disciplinary scientists. So just to sum up, again, to go back to the beginning, I think a lot of this has to do with governance, and not just governance, complex diagrams, but really complex human relationships. I think human dimensions, when we refer to human dimensions, that definitely includes social science. But I think it also really just touches on relationships and what it takes to work together to solve these problems. And a lot of that has to do not just with how one program matches up to another, how one region matches up to another, but how individuals get along and how they work together. So NOAA is really excited about the LCC framework and the CSC framework. There are a lot of, hopefully what I've demonstrated is a lot of different places where we've already made connections, and we hope to really build on those connections in the future. So that's it. Thanks. Yep.
Questions for Adam? Or Dan, if you've thought of some for Dan. There was a lot of overlap between those two presentations, and we got one hand back here first.
This is for both Adam and Dan. From the standpoint of the governance structure, a lot of the concepts that were there before, adaptive capacity, anticipation, vulnerability, and so on, there's beyond the programmatics, there are opportunities to learn about how those concepts have been used. And it would be good to hear from you, Adam, as to where some of those ideas have played a role in why you see the programs you do. So they're not out there trying to rediscover adaptive capacity, they're trying to use the concept. Mm-hmm. They're not out there trying to rediscover social vulnerability, they're trying to use the concept. Mm-hmm. And the idea then is to talk about how that informs anticipatory coordination. And so there's a lot of background literature.
Yeah, it's always good when your boss asks you a question. Talk about a loaded question. So, Well, I can just speak from my own experience, with the RISAs, what we're trying to do. The RISAs have been around for 15 years, and what we're trying to do is develop a governance plan for RISAs, but without killing what has been really essential to that evolving community of practice. So we're not trying to make that as a part of NOAA being top-down and sort of prescribing specific science priorities. What we're really trying to do is draw on what I was talking about, is really identifying these qualities that we're hoping to maintain between individual research groups. So open communication, openness to thinking across disciplines, acknowledgement that participatory processes, working with decision makers to co-produce knowledge, is really what we're all about. That's not to say that co-production works in every case, that there are diverse approaches. And that has been, as the literature suggests, that RISAs really are experiments in science policy. So we look at them as 11 different experiments. There are, we've often been asked whether or not we will ever change RISAs from a competitive research program where they have to compete for a new 5-year award every 5 years. And I think, at least right now, the benefit of having that competition is that they're constantly evolving and experimenting with how they approach developing science that could be useful. So I don't know if, Dan, if you have anything else to add.
I don't know for sure, but I guess what I think is that one of the things that we see is both these formal attempts to do more coordination, and so we also see these sort of organic emergent governance happening because the problems are so complex that no one authority can, by design from the top, come up with a strategy to address it. I think two examples that are here in Colorado. One is the bark beetle, and there's a Colorado bark beetle coalition that has sort of organically grown up to try to deal with that, and it involves all these same partners. But it wasn't because the chief of the Forest Service said we should do this, or that it came from Washington, but it came from the local stakeholders who are sometimes national governments organizations, coming together in specific contexts, looking at what can we do here to solve this problem, what information do we need, what resources does the Forest Service have to contribute to helping us understand our situation. And so I think one of the messages or the lessons of that is that as an agency, we need to be prepared for that and recognize when that's happening and understand our role in that, and not necessarily try to take control of those situations, but to be a good partner in those things, because they're not all going to come from us. So that's my one thought.
Could I just add to that really quickly? I'm sorry, because I thought actually I'm really just going to highlight something Daniel said, is that we have a lot to learn from other countries too. So on the issue of adaptive governance, there has been quite a bit of work done on drought and farming in Australia, because Australia is facing this problem. They're way ahead of us, partly because they've faced this problem perhaps more acutely than we have. And really what they've illustrated is that centralized expert management is sort of linear, and it tends to lead to the idea that we will reduce uncertainty and we will just hand over systems for those farmers to use, whereas they really have to feel like they can take ownership over different ways to get around drought. And then on top of that, we're never going to reduce the uncertainty. We are living with uncertainty and making decisions under uncertainty.
So I'm Jeff Morissette with the North Central Climate Science Center. I'm wondering if Adam could go back to the Missouri Basin slide, just to make sure Dan was aware. When your slide had the question mark of Colorado and
in terms of the possible places we might go.
Yeah, just to call your attention to this as something that the North Central Climate Science Center is very interested in, and we are working with Doug Cluck on this.
Great.
An interesting opportunity for next step.
Great.
Hi, I'm Melinda Coslow, National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes Office. Thanks again for both of your talks. I do a lot of work with people that do adaptation at a local scale, be through wildlife management, restoration, ecological restoration. And, part of what we do is try to help them get this climate information that NOAA provides, either through the CSCs or, state climatologists, what have you. And our issue is that it's still sort of kind of all over the place, getting this information still all over the place. And so I wanted to know if there's an update on the climate service and whether or not you're still pursuing that, or if there's going to be some sort of portal that maybe through the LCCs or some other vehicle will be able to have more synthesized information from one place. I just wondered if you could.
Yeah, so the update on the climate service is that there's no update. We did not get it. Our proposal for a climate service was turned down by Congress. But really, when you look at NOAA's climate activities, we still have a goal structure. And when you look at NOAA's climate activities, all the capabilities are still there. So it's really up to us to be able to help map or identify the points of entry maybe a little bit better for folks at the local scale. I would add a caveat, though, that I've heard the notion that people want a one-stop shop. And I think that's a myth. I don't think that exists. I don't think that should exist. When you look at, for example, climate models, you could have 15 different climate models, and some of them may actually diverge significantly in terms of their results. That's okay. I mean, that just reflects our understanding at this stage, and that gives you an envelope of risk. So we have a climate portal to help direct people. It's in development. I think what you'll see, hopefully over time, is multiple entry points depending on the problem and the place that you're working in. So we're not there yet, obviously, but we are still working on that.
Is there one last question?
So if all the capabilities are there that will be represented in climate service, did you really need that extra funding anyway?
Well, we actually didn't ask for extra funding. What we asked to do was centralize and reorganize so that people could identify, more of a structure than we have now.
So if it wasn't an aspect of funding, what was the concern?
Right.
Would you like to throw that one back to your boss?
Well, as I understand, some of the concerns were related to all the same things that make climate a sensitive issue in different parts of the U.S. It's a politically sensitive issue. I think that, there were some sensitivities that we were not being an honest broker, and I don't think that's actually very warranted. We are not, saw a presentation earlier today that on the CSC, LCC, that you're providing science but not and information about different response options but not being prescriptive. So the idea is to expand the options that people have and understand the level of uncertainty. So I think there were some of those sensitivities, but I don't know if Roger, if you want to comment on that.
Well, I want to thank Adam and Dan one more time for a terrific thing. Just a reminder, we reconvened at Grand Falls